Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our new discussion. That's right, not a continuing one, but a new discussion of the rise of global markets in the late 1600s and early 1700s of European history, right? So now what we're doing is we're actually moving into something very, very new and something that actually required us today to do a lot of review of a lot of our old exploration stuff. Like we did a little bit of took a little bit of an opportunity today to review some of our Reformation things, to review all that little exploration stuff. But the reason why we decided to review some of the exploration stuff is because we are now talking about a new theme in the European history content. And we're now actually going to be discussing the rise of global markets in those late 1600s and early 1700s. So what is now occurring in European history is a huge rise in the efficiency, the trade effectiveness, and the money that's being gained by the European countries, including major players like the Dutch, the French, and the British. And they're actually making all of this money in the global marketplace. It's something that we could actually refer to it through a historical sense, okay? Now, what does that itself mean, right? That's why I have this question mark here, right here. We need to try and understand a little bit better. When we say the rise of global markets, what are we then referring to? What is going on in the late 1600s and early 1700s that is referring to something now as a marketplace that is in fact global, okay? Well, the big thing about it is this is why we decided to review all of our exploration stuff today in class, right? While we had that bottom part of the warm-up to talk about, like, remember the Columbian Exchange, right? Discussing the growth of colonies, right? That's why I saw how many colonies y'all could just kind of name off of the top of your head and stuff like that in class today, because it's going to relate to all of this, okay? Because you got to remember where Europe's place in the world is, right? It's like location is going to make it so it's actually very far away from areas like India and areas like North and South America. But that did not stop Europe from setting up a trade system and trade routes that spanned the entire Atlantic Ocean and then also went all the way around Africa into the Indian Ocean, creating a very sophisticated global marketplace. So that's what we mean when we're talking about the global markets. We're talking about these huge trade networks that now span all over most of the world, leaving out maybe just a little bit of the Pacific. But they will get involved later on as we get closer into the 1800s, okay? Now, the thing about it that you have to understand, though, as we're getting into those late 1600s and early 1700s, that exploration stuff that we talked about all the way back in Unit 1, when we discussed Ferdinand, Isabella, Columbus, Vasco da Gama, Henry the Navigator, Hernan Cortez and the conquest of the Aztecs, like Francisco Pizarro and the subjugation of the Incan people, okay? When we discussed all those different elements, the Columbian Exchange, the encomienda system, the growth of English and French colonies in North America. When we discussed all that stuff, that was mostly happening in the 1500s. Then we took a lot of time in the 1600s to talk about the growth of absolutism and how absolutists are actually going to use and gain a lot of power from those things that were set up during the exploration period. Well, what's now occurring in the late 1600s and 1700s is a huge amount of money is coming into Europe, giving a lot of wealth, power, and dominance to a lot of those governments, right? Increasing the power of absolutist governments, and then also increasing the funding and the amount of monetary gain that exists within Europe itself. So something that we need to understand, though, is that there are two separate spheres to this global marketplace that is beginning to grow, okay? You've got the Atlantic sphere right here that includes, of course, the colonies of North America, the colonies of South America, the transatlantic slave trade, which is being that's coming out of Africa, and currently at this point in history being dominated mostly by the Spanish/Portuguese. And then you also have Europe, who is going to be in charge of processing a lot of these raw materials into finished products and then actually shipping manufactured goods back to the colonies and then also to the Africans themselves. So that's one sphere of the global marketplace we have, which is sometimes often referred to as the West Indies over here in the Caribbean, okay? Then we have the East Indies and India over here, okay? The Indian Ocean is going to be our second sphere that we have to talk about, all right? So that one is the one that, of course, the Europeans were always trying to get to, okay? Remember, they didn't know that these two big, chunks of land were actually out there in the ocean. They actually wanted to get to this original location when, of course, the voyages of Columbus and Vasco da Gama and Bartholomew Diaz and some of these other explorers actually tried to start their voyages. Now, getting into it though, that Indian Ocean marketplace is going to become very, very important. It's going to lead to the subjugation of the Indian subcontinent by the British eventually, and their later dominance of that area as well. It's going to then later on, of course, lead to imperialism in the eastern reaches of Asia when the British actually go against the Chinese in the Opium Wars and things like that. So it's really, really important to understand where we're going to be operating in our next things we're talking about, right? So we've got the Indian Ocean and we've got the Atlantic Ocean being our two biggest spheres. Now, what are the grand differences in these markets, right? A lot of it has to do with the goods and the transfer of goods that are coming out of these different areas. For example, when we talk about the Atlantic sphere, we're discussing mostly the access to the colonies in North and South America and the raw materials that they're producing, right? Things like English tobacco, right, or French indigo. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here as we get a little bit further on. But our first focus is actually going to be in the Indian Ocean, the other marketplace. That Indian Ocean marketplace was still, of course, the earliest thing and the earliest reason why, of course, the Europeans wanted to go to that place was to try and access the spice trade that was coming out of India. Now, as time began to progress and as time began to roll forward, that will still be a major thing about getting those East Asian luxury goods, getting those spice markets, getting a hold of these different items that are coming out of the Indian subcontinent. Later on, they're also going to start growing things like cotton and other textiles, and they'll become major raw material producers as well. So going into it, you have to understand, though, also, quick review, what European country got there first, okay? If you do not remember this, it's really, really okay. But the big thing you need to remember in the back of your mind is that in 1497, Vasco da Gama and the Portuguese actually go all the way around Africa, establishing the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, and then end up going all the way to India, okay? Now, the big thing that we need to understand about the Portuguese as they got there first, though, is they took advantage of a fractured India to try and infiltrate the spice trade, right? Now, when I say a fractured India, I mean that India at the time was not controlled by one synonymous government or one group of people. It actually was several different provinces that spanned the entire Indian subcontinent, including a very large empire known as the Mughal Empire, but then also several other different provincial states that were ran by these things called Rajas, right? R-A-J-S. Rajas were actually Indian princes that actually controlled large swaths of land and territory, almost kind of like a primitive, or like not a primitive, but almost kind of like an Indian form of feudalism. Now, the Rajas had access to a lot of goods, and they actually agreed and made trade deals with a lot of the Portuguese. Something that's important to understand about the Portuguese and when they began to operate in India is they didn't use a ton of force or nearly as much force as later Europeans would use when they actually began to subjugate the Indian spice trade, or infiltrate the Indian spice trade. They actually treated them much more like business partners, all right? Now, the thing about it, though, is that's not going to last for too long, considering the fact that other Europeans are going to see the rise of that marketplace and that sphere in India, and they're going to decide to start taking advantage of it. Now, something that we need to understand when we're talking about the Atlantic marketplace, the Indian Ocean marketplace, is there's a very, very large difference between two terms that will get thrown around a little bit, right? You've got India, and then you've got the West and East Indies, right? Now, when we're looking at this map right here real quick, you have to understand real fast that basically what's going to be going down in this area is going to be two different spheres of course, being in this area, but then also something else. Excuse me, let me compose myself. I'm rambling a little bit. Now, the big thing about when we're looking at this right here was known as the West Indies. That's the Caribbean and then the northern areas of South America. Why do they call it the West Indies? Because for a long time, the Europeans thought they were very, very close to India, right? Now, the thing about it, though, as well, is you've got the Indian subcontinent, which is going to become a major trade destination for a lot of European powers. But then you have the area that the Dutch are going to go after, and it's known as the West Indies, right? An area that includes modern-day countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, and then also different kind of islands that are sometimes referred to as the Spice Islands, like Java, for example, which is really, really well known for growing coffee. And then also the Dutch went there to actually get a hold of that coffee, grow some spices, and also kill a bunch of civets cats. Now, going into it, though, when we actually look into this, you have to understand that this is going to lead, that the competition for the Indian area and the Indian or the East Indies and trying to get a hold of that spice trade is going to lead to the establishment of this thing known as the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, right? Which is actually, of course, just kind of crunched down to the words VOC, or the Dutch East India Company. When we say Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, we mean the East India Company of the Netherlands, right? It's going to be established in 1602, okay? Now, that Dutch East India Company, the way it operates is very important to its trade dominance and how it was able to gain so much wealth so quickly, right? Leading to the growth of cities like Amsterdam and The Hague and different areas like that. Leading to the growth of places like Amsterdam, right? That beautiful canal city that will be actually decorated so well with all of those beautiful homes and all these different items coming in and out, almost like the Venice of Northern Europe. The reason why it's so beautiful is because they were able to actually take advantage and subjugate different areas throughout India and then also the East Indies as well. So something that we need to understand is that the way the Dutch operated in the East Indies and that the Spice Islands like Java and Malaysia is going to be very, very inherently different from the way that the Portuguese operated. The Portuguese operated two different ways than the Dutch did. One, the Portuguese operated as a monarchical company, okay? They actually were directly being funded by people like Henry the... And the differences between the way the Portuguese operated and the Dutch operated was mostly in the fact that you have to understand that the Portuguese were directly funded by their monarchical powers, right? Henry the Navigator and the royals of Portugal actually gave the ships and vessels to their actual merchants to go off and try to find and infiltrate these different spice trade areas. The Dutch, on the other hand, are going to be leading something known as the Dutch East India Company, which is a massive joint stock company, right? Now, the joint stock company and the way that the actual Dutch East India Company works is basically it's a conglomeration of different people that have boats and that they decide to actually have shares in this company, right? The way the joint stock company of the Dutch East India Company, or like the Dutch East India Company worked, is that every single person that contributed either a vessel or bought a piece of the company itself then shared in its profits. Now, the thing about it is at the time in the 1500s when the Portuguese actually started their conquests of like India and their areas and the conquest and infiltration of the spice trade, this is going to lead to them being very limited because monarchs only had certain access to funds. Whereas the Dutch East India Company is a giant mashup of everyone throughout the northern Netherlands, all of their money together, right? It's going to be a bunch of other different individuals and wealthy merchants bringing their money together to create that joint stock company and share in its wealth and all of the things and items that it ends up bringing back from India, right? So the thing about it that you have to understand is this is going to be extremely effective. Now, the creation of the joint stock company known as the East India Company is not going to be just like a little bit effective. It's going to be massively effective. When we look right here at the market like industry or the market caps or the market wealth of some of the largest companies in all of history, as you can see, I'm right now recording this on a MacBook, right, which is made by Apple computers. This right here is my iPhone. We also sometimes look at Apple as one of the biggest companies that the world has ever seen, right? Well, actually, interestingly enough, it's not that big on the grand scale, right? But one of the largest companies in all of history was none other than the Dutch East India Company, which is actually worth an inherent 7 times the amount that the Apple computers is actually worth. That is how much money and how effective that joint stock company like setup is actually going to be. Now, something that we need to also understand, though, is the way that the Portuguese operated in these areas is going to be important. They literally just did not, like, they made trade deals with those Rajas and kind of treated them like they were actually people in a business, right? Whereas the joint stock company of the Dutch East India Company is going to go to places like the Java Islands and different areas of the East Indies and take over using force and subjugate them directly and actually using violence to take over these areas, right? That is the big difference right there between Portuguese trade negotiations and the fact that the Dutch went into these areas and took it over, right? And then there was one area called like Batavia that they actually even bought directly from the Portuguese, which is absolutely wild. Now, the copycat companies are going to begin to actually pop up and kind of mimic the things that the Dutch were doing, creating their own joint stock companies so they can actually get in on a little bit of this global marketplace. The copycat companies including the British East India Company, which is actually founded 2 years before the Dutch East India Company was, but it kind of like failed a little bit early on, right? It didn't fail, but it actually didn't like struggle to make huge amounts of money until people like Queen Elizabeth are going to grant them monopolies on certain products and then also trade monopolies with the colonies that are going to begin to grow inside of North America, right? And the French East India Company is going to make theirs as well because Louis XIV is not about to allow the British and the Dutch to have their own funny little companies and him not have one as well, right? The Dutch East India Company begins to grow though, and Louis and Jean-Baptiste Colbert start the French East India Company in 1664. So what this is going to lead to though is eventually Britain and France are going to start competing directly for India itself, right? So as the Portuguese influence begins to draw back and the Dutch continue to grow their wealth, the English and the French are going to use not only their influence, but they're going to use the thing that the Dutch don't have: massive military and massive technology and massive funds, including also drawn from the taxes of the giant population that both these countries have. And they kind of basically are the two big brothers to the Dutch who could not eventually compete with them the way that the French and the British are actually going to be able to pull it off. Now, continuing the rise of these global marketplaces, you have to understand as well that there are going to be some massive rivalries in the Atlantic trade system as well, okay? So going into it, the growth of colonies is going to be the biggest reason why that happens. French colonies and English colonies are going to begin to grow in ad nauseum in these areas of North America, right? So if we were to zoom in right here to this map real fast, you got to understand and remember where these Europeans are beginning to operate in these different areas, okay? So for example, if we were actually to kind of change things up a little bit and talk about the English, so the location of these different colonies is going to be really important and who owns them, right? So the English colonies are going to be set up right here along the Atlantic coast, the 13 original colonies, of course, as you know. The French colonies, on the other hand, are going to span this area, following the Mississippi River down, expanding also up into what is now French Canada and stuff like that, and this entire area known as the Louisiana territory. And then everything from this area and south was controlled mostly by the Spanish, all right? Now, these different colonies are going to actually be very, very large cash cows for a lot of these different European countries, including things like by creating raw materials and then also exchanging different goods in the growth of plantation economics, okay? Now, the growth of colonies is going to lead to like places like England and France becoming massively wealthy, all right? And this is going to be all in the aftermath of the Columbian Exchange. But the results of these different colonies that are growing in that area is the growth in state-funded piracy, which is going to be a big thing we're going to talk about right now. So what that mean by that is basically like people like Elizabeth I, right, while the English colonies were beginning to grow, were directly funding actions that you would consider piracy, or people being pirates, right? She had different people that actually worked for her, like Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Francis Drake, that she would tell directly to go and raid Spanish ships or take things from them. But when she talked about them, she didn't refer to them as pirates. She referred to them as her privateers. Now, what is this going to do except none other than create rivalries and tension between these European areas as they begin to fight and vie for access to these different global trade market routes, right? Now, the other big thing about it, though, is like that state-funded piracy is going to lead to like these different European countries kind of beginning to get on the precipice of war, right? Because basically they were all looking for their different items that would make them their large amounts of money. For example, English tobacco becomes a massive thing that spans most of Europe. Spanish and Portuguese, their slave trade becomes a thing that spans most of Europe, right? Now, going into it, though, as well, that you need to understand, this is going to actually begin to be foreshadowed by these things called the Navigation Acts that were passed in 1651 under Cromwell, right? Oliver Cromwell, when he came to power long after Elizabeth died and after the first two Stuart monarchs, he's going to pass these things known as the Navigation Acts. And the Navigation Acts begin to foreshadow that violence to come because everybody wants access to those Atlantic Sea marketplace or the Atlantic marketplaces that include all the raw materials coming from the like colonies and going into the proto-factory system that's beginning to grow in Europe. That's why the putting out system in the cottage industry is such a big deal, because we're beginning to see the birth of a manufacturing center in Europe. And since we're seeing the birth of a manufacturing center, it means that they need things to actually process. Another big thing was French indigo, and then also French sugar that was coming from some of the Caribbean sugar islands, particularly what you know as modern-day Haiti, right? Now, going into it, though, as well, that you need to understand is now we're going to move into topic 5.3, which is actually going to be talking about the growth of the British, right? Because out of the big three, France, Britain, and the Dutch, the British are going to be the ones that assume the most power, right? And now, why were these colonies in this area, especially the Atlantic Ocean colonies, so crucial to British growth? Well, a lot of it actually relates back to that East India Company that had monopolies on goods like shipping tobacco, tea, and other items to and from the colonies now due to those Navigation Acts. Well, they would make an expansive amount of money, right? So this is going to lead to the growth and the power of the actual English government, because they are going to begin to tax the profits of the East India Company, and they're going to use those things to do one particular thing: build up a very large naval fleet, right? A naval fleet that is almost going to be beatable in the waters as we go into the late 1700s and into the late 1800s, okay? So the thing about it is the British dominance in their imperial navy will begin to grow because they use a lot of this tax money to build these new types of vessels. These vessels are known as ships of the line, right? Which are these huge masted sailed vessels that are like rowed up with sometimes in the neighborhood of 50 cannons along the side that can destroy almost anything, right? They then use those vessels in these like ships of the line to protect none other than the East India Company boats that are coming to and from the colonies, bringing these new raw materials so they can make more money. And now that the East India Company is making even more money, the profits and taxes are going up. They're making more ships of the line, which leads them to making more money, which, like, as you can tell, British ascendancy, wealth, and power is growing very, very fast, right? Because a lot of people wonder, why is this going to be so important? Well, the thing about it is as British growth is British wealth is beginning to grow, as Dutch wealth is beginning to grow, as the French see all of this happening, what's going to happen when you have all this money from trade, couple that with some angry kings and mercantilism? It's going to lead to all-out warfare, right? And so we're going to see the competition for goods in the Asian and Atlantic marketplaces, those global marketplaces, lead to massive rivalries. The two biggest rivalries being none other than the British and the French. But what about the Dutch? Why are they not involved in this rivalry as much? Well, the thing about it is the Dutch have certain limitations. Their country's a little bit smaller. They're much more of a maritime, merchant society. They're much more about also the gentry actually growing. They do not have a king that is then trying to actually start a massive war, right? And the other thing about it too is, as well, that you need to understand is that the Dutch had an alliance with the British. Don't ever forget about William William III. William III, that guy that came from the Netherlands and actually took over Britain at the request of Parliament, leading to their glorious revolution because he was married to James II's daughter, Mary, right? Because that's William of William and Mary, who himself was Dutch, right? And after 1688, the Dutch actually had the Dutch and the English had a pretty decent alliance. And then also the English beat the Dutch in a couple of different wars, right? Particularly the biggest ones known as the Anglo-Dutch Wars, right? And that's going to lead to certain colonies and certain colonial areas falling out of Dutch hands and into British ones, right? So right there, for example, is the colony of New York. At the time, mostly owned down here is actually the area of Manhattan, which it actually encompassed, but originally the colony of New York was known as New Amsterdam, right? So we have to understand that the Dutch actually become minor players in the very, very large scheme of great, grandiose warfare, but the British and French are eyeing each other up as the two titans that are about to go to war with each other and destroy each other and parts of the world for their own monetary growth. But that's where we're going to cut it off. I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.